The first sound you hear is not a voice, but the drag of chains through soil. Imagine it, metal grinding against earth, slow, deliberate, as though something buried deep has decided it no longer wishes to stay forgotten. That sound is older than memory, and it does not belong to the living. They say in Georgia, in the ruins of a forgotten plantation, those chains still move at night. Not carried by hands, not rattled by wind, but pulled by the dead who were left in silence, bound and abandoned beneath the ground. 16 slaves, chained in darkness, sealed in a cellar, while their master fled the Union's advance. He locked the door behind him and never returned. Think of that moment, the breathless quiet after the bolt slid into place. The air growing thinner, the sweat dripping from their skin, the clink of iron shackles against stone. They called for water, for mercy, for God himself. But the walls swallowed every prayer. Days passed, throats cracked, flesh weakened. In the end, the silence was not born of peace, but of suffocation. They died with chains still tight around their wrists and ankles, staring into darkness so complete it swallowed even the memory of sunlight. When the estate was finally opened decades later, their remains were found exactly as they had fallen, bone fused to rust, soil blackened as though scorched by something that never burned. The air was sour, wrong, untouched by time or nature. No insects, no rodents, nothing that belonged to life dared enter that chamber. The bodies were gone, yes, but the chains remained. And the chains are the key. Iron does not only bind flesh, it binds memory. It binds rage. That rage did not die. The Lockage Plantation was abandoned, reclaimed by roots and vines, erased from polite history. But in Georgia, the land remembers, and the land does not forgive. Travelers speak of voices whispering beneath the soil, of a silence so oppressive it feels alive. Children wake in the night hearing chains rattle in their dreams. Dogs refuse to cross the fields, and those who dare to descend into the cellar, if they return at all, carry with them the sound of shackles that never stopped moving. This is not folklore, this is cursed inheritance, and once you hear their story, you will never unhear the chains again. Elias Lockage was not the kind of master history records with ceremony. No portraits hang in museums, no monuments preserve his name. He thrived in shadows, a man who bought flesh-like tools, used them until they broke, and discarded them as if their blood carried no weight. His wealth was not in acres of cotton, but in bodies. He built his fortune on suffering, and he built it in silence. But silence never forgets. The chamber beneath his plantation was not an accident of architecture. It was carved deliberately, stone by stone, hidden behind a false wall, sealed away from daylight. He called it containment. But the truth? It was a dungeon, a tomb made in advance. The records that survive, auction slips, scraps of ledgers, carry words like non-compliant, isolated, broken. These were not mere punishments. These were classifications of people locked away to vanish. The dissenters, he called them, men and women who refused to kneel to his commands. When Union forces drew near in 1863, Lockage fled with his money, his papers, his pistol, but not his captives. He locked the door, walked away, and left 16 souls chained in darkness. Hunger hollowed their faces. Thirst tore their voices into whispers. And when death came, it did not come quickly. Some say the last to die clawed the walls, leaving gouges in the clay that can still be traced with your fingertips today. Decades later, when the chamber was opened, the horror should have ended. But it didn't. The chains remained, polished clean as though touched by invisible hands. The bones refused decay, clinging to rust until they crumbled into ash at first light. And the soil beneath them was not merely stained, it was burned, blackened as though fire had raged where no flame could burn. That was the beginning of the whispers. Farmers reported seeing pale figures on the edge of their fields, faces gaunt, eyes wide, ring, as though watching from a time they could never escape. Hunters swore they heard the clinking of chains even when alone in the woods, and families whispered that their children woke screaming, crying out the same words again and again, "Open the door, open the door." But the door was never opened. The dead were never freed. And chains, once set, do not break easily. They bind not just wrists, but memory, vengeance, and something older than flesh. The lockage plantation became more than cursed ground. It became a mouth that swallows all who listen too closely. Not all stories of the lockage plantation come from rumor. Some are carved into paper, into ink that should never have survived the rot of time. A small ledger, discovered decades later in a Savannah antique shop, carried the hand of Samuel Dress, the overseer Elias Lockage left behind. Dress was not an owner. He was not a man of power. He was worse. He was a servant to cruelty, a mouthpiece for obedience, a keeper of the chains. His entries begin with calculation, cold, detached. Each page lists punishments dealt with mechanical precision: lashes, shackles, deprivation of food and light. Rarely a name, only numbers. Containment sustained, 16 remain. His words bleed no sympathy, no doubt. They are the words of a man who no longer saw people, only silence and defiance. But as the months passed, something began to change in his tone. In the spring of 1862, his writing falters, his dates blur. He begins to mention sounds he cannot explain. Chaining holds, no speaking aloud, yet I hear them at night. Another page, whispers beneath the stone. None move, but the chains answer when I listen too closely. His words grow frantic, scattered. The script itself shifts, tight lines giving way to jagged scratches, as if his own hand trembled. By autumn, his ledger is no longer a record of punishment, but a record of haunting. They no longer look at me, but I feel their eyes in the walls. I count 16, always 16. He scratches one phrase again and again in heavy strokes of ink, tearing grooves into the page. They do not sleep. They do not forget me. Then the entries stop. No record of his death, no grave, no closure, only silence, only the pages he left behind. The ledger was passed to historians, dismissed by some as the ramblings of a guilty man unraveling in his own cruelty. But there is something heavier in those words, something darker than guilt. He did not write like a man plagued by conscience. He wrote like a man under siege, beset by voices not his own. And if the whispers that drove Samuel Dress to madness were only the echoes of the dying, why do they still bleed through the soil today? Why do travelers report hearing them in the same rhythm, in the same cadence that he recorded 160 years ago? Because the chains were never broken, and silence is never empty, ever. It was not Union soldiers nor strangers who first uncovered the forgotten chamber. It was the Lockage family themselves. By 1891, decades had passed since Elias fled into obscurity. His bloodline dwindled, his estate abandoned to ivy and rot. But greed has a way of pulling the dead back into daylight. Descendants came to the ruined plantation, hunting inheritance among the bones of a forgotten empire. Behind the cellar wall, they found the stones that should never have been touched again. When their tools struck clay, the air shifted. A draught, cold and damp, poured from cracks that smelled of rust and sickness. They broke through, and what they saw was not a room. It was a wound in the earth. 16 sets of chains still hung from the walls, bolted into the clay, stretched in silence. But the bodies had not rotted as time demands. Some lay slumped, skeletons with iron fused to their bones, brittle yet strangely preserved. Others had collapsed into heaps of blackened ash, as though consumed by a fire that burned without flame, and still their restraints gleamed. Rust had not conquered them. The iron shone faintly, polished by something unseen, as though hands had never stopped tugging at them. The family fled, but before they sealed the wall again, One sheriff's deputy filed a brief report, so grotesque it vanished from the archives soon after. In it, he wrote of soil beneath the bodies, darker than the rest, hardened and charred. He noted the air tasted wrong, like blood and smoke. He ended with one sentence that no official record should have carried: "The dead have not left." After that, the family abandoned the plantation for good, whispering that the ground itself was cursed. They sold nothing, restored nothing, touched nothing. They left the cellar sealed, but word of what lay inside trickled into the towns like poison. Locals said strange lights flickered across the fields at night. Hunters swore that when they passed too close, they felt shackles close around their ankles, dragging them down into soil that seemed to breathe. And always, the sound of chains. No matter the season, no matter the silence, the clinking of iron drifts through the trees at dusk. Sometimes faint, like memory. Sometimes close, like something waiting just behind you. The Lockage family sealed the door, but they could not seal the voices. You can still hear them if you walk too close to that ground. Because what was chained in 1863 was never buried. It was bound. For decades, the Lockage estate slept beneath vines and moss, its story traded only in taverns and whispers, half forgotten even by those who lived closest to it. But the dead are patient. They wait. And sometimes, they place their truths where only the curious will dare to look. In 1947, a historian named Edgar Mallory walked into a small antique shop in Savannah. He was searching for remnants of Civil War estates, ledgers, letters, anything that might piece together forgotten corners of Georgia's past. What he found should never have been sold. Pressed between the cracked pages of a Lockage family Bible was a folded scrap of leather, tied shut, brittle, stained with age. Inside was a diary. It was the ledger of Samuel Dress. Mallory read through the entries with growing dread. The overseer's cold calculations, the punishments, the 16 chained beneath the earth, and then the shift. Pages that seemed to vibrate with fear, words scratched so deep into the parchment that they tore through. The phrase repeated until the page bled. "They do not sleep. They do not forget me." At the back of the book, Mallory found something else. A drawing. 17 figures shackled in a row, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent screams. The ink was blurred, as if smeared by water or tears. But here was the detail that unsettled him most. The ledger spoke of 16. Always 16. And yet, in that drawing, there were 17. Mallory tracked down one of the last Lockage descendants, a frail woman in upstate New York named Margaret. At first she was polite, weary, uninterested in the estate's history, but when he mentioned the ledger, her face drained of blood. She did not answer his questions. She did not deny his claims. She only whispered one sentence before ending the interview. "If you found the ledger, you've already heard them too." And she was right. From Tita. That day forward, Mallory claimed he could no longer sleep in silence. He would wake at night, certain of the sound of chains dragging through his walls. He swore he heard faint voices counting, 1 to 16, then silence, always leaving room for a 17th. His colleagues dismissed his findings as superstition. His article on the Lockage plantation was ignored, but the ledger remained, tucked in his study, a weight that seemed to breathe. And until his death, he refused to spend a night alone. Because once you've heard the chains, you are never alone again. By the early 1970s, the Lockage plantation was no longer a place of history, but of rumor. The fields had long since swallowed the house in a tangle of kudzu and rot. The chamber lay sealed, a scar beneath the soil. Yet whispers lingered. Strange lights, shadows in the tree line, 17 figures in dreams. To a group of university students from Atlanta, it sounded like the perfect research subject. 6 of them, led by archaeology student Charles Wexley, set out to document forgotten Civil War sites. They came armed with notebooks, tape recorders, and a stubborn belief that all legends, when peeled back, reveal only ordinary truth. They were wrong. When they first arrived, they described the plantation as silent, unnaturally silent. No birdsong, no crickets, just the weight of air pressing against their lungs. On their first night, one of the students, Linda Carr, claimed she heard humming beneath her tent, a low rhythm like a lullaby sung through soil. The others laughed, but the second night, no one slept. Tape recorders placed near the cellar wall captured sounds that could not be explained. A dragging scrape like metal against stone, whispered syllables in no language they recognized, and faint, unmistakable, the clink of chains. On the third day, they broke through the cellar. What they found matched the description left in Mallory's notes. 16 iron rings still embedded in the clay, the blackened soil beneath. But there was more. Symbols carved into the walls, fresh, not old. Some matched the Adinkra of West Africa, tied to grief, memory, vengeance. Others were jagged spirals, unfamiliar, desperate, scratches made not by tools, but by fingernails. That night, the students began to unravel. Carr screamed in her sleep, swearing someone had whispered her name directly into her ear. Elkins, the calmest of the group, stood in the field for hours, staring at a tree line, muttering that there were faces between the branches. Wexley's hands shook so violently he could not hold his pen. On the fourth morning, they fled, leaving behind their equipment, their notes, their courage. None of them ever published their findings. But years later, Wexley's private audio journal was found. In the final recording, his voice is barely a whisper, ragged with fear. "I thought they were ghosts. They're not. They're awake, and they remember." Of the 6, 3 suffered mental collapse within 2 years. One disappeared in 1978 while hiking near Wilkes County. Her body was never found. Locals say the forest does not give back what it likes. And always, the number. 16 voices, 17 shadows. For a time, the Lockage Plantation seemed to retreat back into rumor. The land overgrew, the house collapsed, and only stories clung to the soil. But greed is a stronger lure than silence. In 2006, the dead were disturbed once more. A private development company, Asher Heritage Holdings, purchased the estate at a silent auction. Their plan was bold, lucrative, and blind: to restore the plantation as a living museum of antebellum architecture. They envisioned guided tours, reconstructed slave quarters, reenactments. Investors whispered of overnight stays in the manor, where history could be experienced by paying guests. None of them considered what history truly lived there. The project began with clearing. Bulldozers tore through vines and trees. Workers ripped away the soil, unearthing stones that had been sealed for more than a century. At first it was ordinary: broken bricks, collapsed beams, rusted iron. But within weeks, accidents began. A laborer fell into a shallow trench and shattered his spine. Yet before he struck the ground, witnesses swore they saw his body yanked downward, as if dragged by unseen chains. Another worker was found at dawn wandering barefoot through the fields, his eyes wide, his mouth mumbling a single phrase over and over. 17, 17, 17. He never returned to the site. The worst came when the crew reopened the cellar. They found the chamber again. The rings still bolted into the walls, the blackened earth beneath. This time, though, the symbols carved into the clay were fresh, carved not by centuries of rot, but recently, as if someone or something had been scratching from the inside. That night, the project leader, Thomas Asher himself, stayed behind with 2 guards to document the site. By morning, the guards were found unconscious, blood trickling from their ears. Asher was gone. The only trace was his notebook. Pen on the ground, the final page soaked in ink and sweat. 4 words scrawled in frantic repetition. They are not gone. The project collapsed. Funding evaporated. Investors pulled out. The land was declared unsafe, fenced, and forgotten again. But locals knew better. They said the disturbance had awakened what the earth had been holding down. For months after, the nearby towns reported strange dreams, nightmares shared between strangers. always the same. A cellar, 16 chained figures, and a 17th standing apart, whispering in a tongue no living ear could understand. And now you, hearing this, are part of it too. You cannot unhear the chains. You cannot unknow the number. 16 bound, 1 unbound, 17 shadows that move when no one is watching. The Lockage Plantation no longer exists on maps. The land has been parceled, renamed, erased. But the curse doesn't need geography. It needs only memory. And now, through this telling, it has you. Think back to the stories, the ledger that shouldn't have been found, the students who heard the chains, the developer who vanished. They were bound together by one thread. They listened. They let the story in. And once you hear the voices, you are counted among them. 16 and 1 more. The 17th. Every witness described it. The overseer drew it. The historian heard it. The students saw it. The developers felt it. 17 shadows in a place that should hold 16. The 17th is never bound, never chained. It walks free, and it follows. Perhaps tonight you will hear it. A faint sound against your floorboards, a link dragging against wood. A voice whispering a number you cannot forget. 16. Then silence, waiting for you to answer with 17. Because here is the truth. The curse is not of the dead. It is of the living. Each time the story is told, it spreads, pulling another listener into its count. You, sitting here believing you are safe because this is only a story. You are already the next. The Lockage estate does not need to rise again. It has risen in your memory, in your home, in your breath as you whisper the number aloud, 16 and then 17. And now there is one final rule, one final thread. Those who have heard the story must bind themselves or be left unbound like the 17th. And to bind yourself, you must write it down. Twice. Write it once for the dead. Write it once for yourself. The phrase is simple, but do not take it lightly. In the comments, write, "I hear the chains." Do it twice, no more, no less. For those who break the pattern are the ones the 17th takes first. So go on. You've listened. You've joined. Now decide if you'll bind yourself or walk free. But remember, freedom isn't safety. Freedom is the 17th, and it's already waiting.